Hi, I'm Dan Livesay. I'm an assistant professor of history here at Drury University. And my research interests are primarily focused on slavery and the slave trade and ideas about race in what we call the Atlantic world. So all the parts of the Atlantic Ocean that kind of touch the shores of North America, the Caribbean, South America, Africa, Europe. And so what I'm looking at is how people kind of change their idea about what race might mean. And in particular, I look at families that have mixed race children, so children that have some kind of African ancestry, and how people can kind of change their idea about what race means when they have a cousin or a grandson or a niece or a nephew who has African ancestry. So what I'm really kind of looking at in my own personal research is how ideas about family really inform ideas about race in the 18th and the 19th centuries. Because I'm so interested in this Atlantic world broadly, one of the things I try to do is talk about how the 13 colonies that become the United States are really part of a kind of global environment, so that we think about globalization as being something in the modern day that we're a new society that's suddenly global, but in fact that had happened for a long period of time. In fact, in the 18th and 19th centuries, people were going back and forth across the Atlantic, ideas were moving back and forth. There was lots of changes and developments that were really kind of worldwide. And so trying to put America in that early America form into a larger global perspective, so that we look at the importance of the Caribbean and South America and Europe to what people in the early colonies were experiencing. So I try to have a kind of global aspect to what I'm talking about, so that people can kind of see that we've long been part of a big worldwide phenomenon. And then because I think slavery is such an important part of my research, one of the things I like to do in my classes is show how a topic like slavery, which when you think about kind of has maybe a concrete sense in your head, it's this sort of fixed thing that's unchanging. And a lot of times, you know, when you think about slavery, you imagine in your head someone picking cotton in the 19th century in Alabama, and that's what slavery was, and it always was like that. And one of the things that I think history really enables us to do is to say, no, in fact, it was much more different than that. There's lots of different stories about slavery. So a slave in North Carolina had a different life than a slave in Brazil, than a slave in Canada, than a slave in Jamaica. And so this idea about slavery, which seems so concrete and unchanging, actually has a very complicated story behind it. And so I think I try to use that to get students to think about the way that, you know, the world around them has a kind of deep-seated history to it. And so that's one of the lessons I hope students take from my classes. I think one of the things that history does is it tries to show you that, you know, how do we get to where we are today? So, you know, the world around us didn't just kind of spring up overnight. It evolved over thousands of years of people making decisions and events occurring. And so one of the things that history does is really tries to show you that there's a world around you, there's a world outside of yourself. And I think the humanities does that as well, and that's one of the key lessons of the humanities, is to kind of externalize your own experience, to step outside what you see around you and to not just take things for granted. And so I think that when you're able to kind of see that, hey, someone that might have lived in the same town, maybe even the same neighborhood as me 100 years ago, would have had a completely different way of viewing the world. They might have had a completely different way of interacting with someone else. And it kind of makes you realize that you have a certain time and a place, and that where you are in history really affects the way that you think about things and the way that you relate to people. So I think that helps you to kind of externalize your own experience. And when I started as an undergraduate many years ago, I actually started as a psychology major, and one of the first classes I took was a developmental psychology class. And so we sort of learn about the stages of development that children go through. And one of the things that really struck with me was that there's a moment in a child's life when they realize that the world around them is different than them, that everything is not in their head necessarily, that the person that they're looking at has a different way of thinking and a different experience, and not everything is just what's inside them. And I think the humanities kind of reinstills that lesson over and over, that the world around us really is kind of different. We have to kind of take a step back and step outside ourselves a little bit to examine what the rest of that world is and how it can kind of teach us a little bit about ourselves. And so, in fact, I think it's part of that ever-growing stage of development, of maturation, of understanding your place in the world. And so that's what I think history brings to people. I think that's what humanities brings to people.